Okay, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Kim. And I'm very excited to be with you this morning, everyone. Good morning. I always say it to my class. I know it's early, and I know that a lot of times having early morning classes is not the easiest thing in the world. So, sending some positive vibes to all of you. Today, I'd like to talk with you about microfiction and my particular perspective on microfiction. But before I really get into that too heavily, I should probably break down the forms of fiction. And I'm sure that you're probably aware of it, but just in case there are a few people who might not know this terminology, I want to just go through the list right quick. So you already know about the novel, which is an extended work of fiction. Some people say a novel starts at 60,000 words. Other people say 50,000 words. The science fiction and fantasy writers of America, they say 40,000 words. So I guess for purposes of any discussion, you could say 40,000 words or more would be a novel. Now, the area beneath 40,000 words, like say if we go from 40,000 down to about 15,000, we're dealing with the novella, okay? Beneath that, from 15,000 to 8,000 words or so, that's the area they call the novelette. Once you get beneath that, you have between 8,000 and 1,000 words, and that's your typical short story. And where it gets interesting is when you start to dip down below 1,000 words. So 1,000 words is commonly described as flash fiction to most people. But once you get into the flash fiction territory, there are little subsets beneath flash fiction. For example, once you get down to about 300 to 500 words or so, you're in an area that they call microfiction. And the area that I'm more interested in is not even at 300 words, not the 200 words, but actually the 100-word story. So the 100-word story we refer to as a drabble, and a 50-word story we refer to as a dribble. But believe it or not, you can keep going down in word count, and there's a whole family of stories referred to as 6-word stories. And I'll talk a little bit about the 6-word story later on, but my sweet spot is between the dribble and the drabble. So how did I start writing microfiction? Actually, I started out writing novels because that's what I was told that publishers wanted, and that was the only way to really get published. So I wrote 7 of them. I wrote basically one a year for a period of time. And I just kept feeling like I was using more words than I needed to. Like I could get my ideas across with fewer words. So then that's when I started thinking about, novella was the wave of the future for me. So I wrote 5 of them. I like writing novellas for a while because they reminded me of indie films and basically the same length as a movie script. Plus, it allows you to get those cinematic ideas out of your head without the added work of actually trying to shoot a film. And then I started thinking, I don't know, novellas are kind of long. At least they were feeling long to me. So I thought about short stories. Why not write short stories? Maybe I could do my best work there. And I ended up writing 4 collections of short stories. But my approach to short stories was kind of like a musician's approach to writing it or doing an album. I treated the short stories like they were songs and the collections themselves like they were actually albums. And it felt good for a while. And then I started to feel that some of my short stories were just the length they were because of the requirements for the literary journal that was looking to publish them. And I wondered if I could go shorter. So while I was going through this thought process, I came across a writer by the name of Lydia Davis. And Lydia Davis, well, first and foremost, she's a translator. She's a translator of the French language. And she had been translating Marcel Proust In Search of Lost Time, which is the biggest novel ever written. It's over 1.2 million words. Now, if you've been following me so far, that's going in the wrong direction for me. But it was going the wrong direction for her. She had done all of this translating, and she was like, is it possible to say these things without using 1.2 million words to do it? So she started writing these stories that were basically a paragraph long. And as I was reading her works, I was thinking, she's saying more in this paragraph than I'm saying in a 20-page story. So I started looking into the things that led her to that particular short form. And she talked a lot about prose poetry. So if you're a fiction writer, you're definitely going to want to spend some time reading poetry. I mean, there are countless benefits to doing so, but with prose poetry and microfiction, they're very, very close to each other. They're almost like first cousins, if not actual siblings. One of the key differences being with the prose poem, although it's still structured as prose, the emphasis is not on the narrative arc of the story. It's more on the setting, the imagery, things of that nature. So I started reading more prose poems, and I started looking at poets like Russell Edson or Beth Ann Finley, Terrence Hayes, Hanif Abdul-Rakib, Claudia Rankin, just anybody who was writing in that space and seeing what they were doing with it. And then I decided, let me try flash fiction. It's shorter than the short story. Mixed results there. Sometimes I would get accepted on pieces, other pieces weren't working. And I knew why they weren't working, because they weren't at the natural length that they should have been. And yeah, it just really forced me to reconsider things in a different way. And I started thinking, well, maybe I'm not even a fiction writer. Maybe I'm a poet. Maybe I'm a poet and just didn't know it, you know? So I started focusing on trying to use as few words as possible and really get into that mindset. And I discovered an African-American literary poetry form called the Kwan Saba. It was created in 1995 by Dr. Eugene Redman out of St. Louis. And what was interesting about this form, it's a 49-word poem, had a hard word count. So it's a it breaks down like this. There's 7 lines, 7 words per line, and no word of more than 7 letters. So I started to write these as practice for my fiction. And the challenge was, how do you get your ideas to fit into only 49 words? And it became very clear to me that every single word mattered. So while I was doing this, I kind of found out about something called a dribble, the 50-word story. I was already writing poetry that was 49 words. It's just one more word, 50 words. And so I thought that it was going to be easy to transition. But to be honest with you, that extra word, it felt like it was a mile apart in terms of how I had to approach writing it. But I experimented with it, wrote a couple of them, got a few published, and I started to feel like, well, maybe I'm not so bad at this. Maybe this is my thing. So I started writing quite a few of them. And honestly, since 2018, I have not written a short story, a novelette, a novella, or a novel. I've only written microfiction. And since 2019, I've actually had 512 microfiction stories published. So I guess it's safe to say that that is my thing at this point. So how does one go about tackling writing microfiction? Okay. A lot of the times a nugget of an idea comes from some stray or interesting thought. For example, I wrote a 50-word story titled Until the End of Time, based off the idea of automatic movement in watches. It's the closest thing to a perpetual motion machine that I can see in everyday life. So let me ask you this question. If you had the power to build something using automatic movement, what would it be? Let me share a story with you. It's called Until the End of Time. And this is actually my take on that particular idea. And this is just 50 words, excluding the title. The other owners at the dog park eyed Stonewall curiously, attempting to make sense of the dog's ticking movements. Ian welcomed the attention. Only another skilled horologist would understand the complex automatic movements, and only someone who had buried one too many beloved dogs would understand his need to build one. So you get the ideas and you just kind of play with them and follow them. Sometimes I get ideas from fairy tales. I like to rework fairy tales a lot of times. In fact, I'll share something with you about that if you give me a moment. I'm sorry, I have so many of these stories. This is actually one of my books, The Strange Museum, which is compiled of 150 word stories. But rather than trying to figure out where in the world the story is located, I'll just kind of tell you what the story's about. That might work even better. Okay, I'll try this one. It's called How to Train a Beast. The first time the beast came to the village was by accident. He had simply lost his way. However, once he learned the townspeople were willing to feed him one of their own each year, gradually incorporating more festivities and rituals into his visits, the beast vowed to keep returning. So, you get ideas from different places, and that was one of those ideas. I get ideas from the news, a lyric of a song. Like, I don't know if you're like a Beatles fan or something, but the Beatles have this song, Come Together, which has the strangest lyrics I've heard. Among the strangest lyrics I've ever heard. And you take just one line from a song and let your imagination kind of follow that. What does it make you think of? And then see if it leads you to a point where there's a question that you could possibly answer with your story. I've gotten ideas from colors. In fact, I've written 5 stories about the color purple. That's not my favorite color either. It just happened to be a color that I decided to write about. I found interesting things on YouTube. I got really hooked into watching videos of people who were colorblind receiving the Enchroma glasses that allow you to see colors more vibrantly. And I went down a rabbit hole with that one. But it produced stories, and you just get ideas from anywhere. Anecdotes that other people have shared with me or that I've actually had happen to myself. Interesting words. There have been times when I've just fanned the dictionary and said, oh, this is a really fascinating word here. Let's see. And then just kind of build a story from there. Looking at photographs, paintings, random ironic musings, like that person who says that she will never marry somebody shorter than she is. And then you see her at the next class reunion and the person she's married to is a full foot shorter than she is. And just prompts. I mean, there are endless prompts on the internet. Just see what actually speaks to you at that moment and try writing. Can everybody hear me? Okay, cool. All right. So sometimes I just sit down and start writing the first thing that comes to my mind and following it, trying to find the situation, the turn in a tense moment, a realization, something that allows for an idea to resonate. I think with microfiction, it's more about resonance than it is about anything else. I used to take my flash fiction and keep trimming the words down until I got to 100, but that ended up with mixed results. I realized that the best way for me to write microfiction was to build up, not to shave it down. So rather than thinking about a flash fiction piece and then working downward, I would think, well, this is a perfect place to actually talk about the apocryphal story often attributed to Hemingway. And you might have heard it, the 6-word story. It says, for sale, baby shoes, never worn. And when you look at something that's short, it's forcing the reader to insert everything else. It's very interactive for the reader. I read that, I feel sad when I read it. Some people read it and they have a different emotion, just depends on what you're bringing to the story. But For Sale, Baby Shoes, Never Worn. And also Augusto Monterroso's story, The Dinosaur. And it's really short when translated. And this is just one of the translations for the story, but it reads like this. When he awakened, the dinosaur was still there. And some people are like, well, that's not really a story, but to me it is, because it forces me to plug in all of the other information. There's a lot that's being said with very few words. So if you think about the story in smaller notes, then you just build up on that, providing what's necessary to make the reader engage his, her, their imagination in a way that fills all of the story that's implied on the page. I also borrow from poetry, looking for ways to make the language flow more rhythmically. I play around with alliteration, repetition of consonant sounds, assonance, repetition of vowel sounds, slant rhyme, things that don't actually rhyme but sound like they could, imagery, occasionally repetition. But I'm always keen on what the story actually is. And since I teach creative writing classes myself, I use microfiction a lot in my own classes. The most challenging thing my students have mentioned to me is that they find it difficult to lock in on an idea that can be expressed in such a small space. They're used to reading and writing big, and I get that. I did that for most of my life. But what I tell them is, think about the moment either before or after the climax of the story, assuming that we're using that Freitag plot arc. I prefer after the climax though, because somewhere in that falling action, you're seeing the character react to something that has happened. I think the temptation for most people is to stop the story almost at the climax. Like, whoa, that's supposed to be a surprise ending, but I'm more interested in what's going to happen or what the reaction is going to be than I am the fact that this unusual thing occurred. So rather than stopping with the confrontation of the beast, show me what the reaction to the beast is. And to that end, I have to admit, not a big fan of surprise endings because they only work when they're earned. And with microfiction, there's just not a lot of space to earn that. So instead, you have to look for the greatest point of resonance. Think about a food flavor that remains on your palate after you finish eating. That's what you're trying to shoot for with the microfiction. Because the form in many ways breaks many of the rules that we assign to writing fiction, I encourage students to first acknowledge what the rules are, so that if you decide to break or even mildly fracture a few, you can explain what you did and why you did it. Imagine there will be people whose definitions of stories are just going to exclude microfiction altogether. And I'm fine with that. I mean, for me though, I can see an entire world inside of these small stories. I see the ability to explore many characters, many genres, many ideas without the expectations that often accompany longer works. Let me give you an example of what I mean. When I was writing novels, the first novel I wrote was a romantic comedy using African-American characters. And it did all right. And then I wrote another one, and then it just got to a point where people started to see me as that kind of writer. And I was like, I really want to tell more stories than this. And when I started deviating from that, those books didn't do as well, because the industry wants to be able to brand an author with a particular identity. And I decided, you know what? Brand me as a short story writer without the other labels. That way, when I write my collections, I can write things that are Afrofuturistic. I can write things that are romantic. I can write things that are horror. I love horror. You can write any genre you want because it's more about the form than it is about the genre itself. And that's one thing that I love about microfiction. Microfiction can also be good at helping you to start your longer works. If you've been wanting to write a novel and you didn't really know where you were going to start with it, you didn't know how to start, trust me, I've been there. My first novel, I actually attempted it 25 times before I got past page 20. I mean, I thought I knew what I was doing. I knew what I wanted the story to be, but I didn't know where to start the story. I got lost in point of view. All right. I don't know if this has ever happened to any of you, but there have been times when I've written a story and just felt like the point of view was wrong. Maybe I started out and I was third person limited. I was like, okay, this is not working. First person, maybe I'm first person point of view from the wrong character. Second person, oh, now I'm getting cute here, and I could do some things there, but I don't think I could sustain it over the length of a novel. And so you have to play around with it and find that exact balance. It's like you are creating a puzzle that only you can figure out. You know where the pieces go. And if you've ever written something and you knew that the rest of these pieces were in the right place, but there was a missing piece and you couldn't figure out, you knew you could put something there, but it didn't feel like it really fit. So that's the wonder of being a writer, is you created this dilemma that only you can figure out. And it's a good feeling when you do figure it out, though. Okay, so how does microfiction play into writing longer works? So think about the fact that each story has things that happen before the story even started and things that are going on after the story has already ended. There are also places that are directly inside of the story that you've written that could be expanded upon. I call this the Michael Jackson beaded jacket theory. All right, Michael Jackson had that red jacket with all the zippers. So think about it like this. If you have, like in the story that I shared with you about the dog, the mechanical dog, if Ian built the dog and he had buried dogs before, maybe I could show his relationship with one of his previous dogs. The process had to be a challenging process to create an automatic dog in the first place. So what does that look like? There are all these different places where you can go in and unzip the story and pull out more information. And you begin building things organically from there. So it could be a useful tool in terms of writing longer works. But even if you decide to never pursue microfiction beyond just the practice of doing this for other things, I can still see tremendous benefits in just learning to appreciate language and to use words sparingly. Like, why say something in 20 words when you can just say it in 5 words? I mean, think about words like it's money. I spend it, but I only spend what I need to spend. I try not to spend more than I have, or just spend recklessly. So that's been my approach. And I guess above all, I should say that I encourage people to try microfiction simply because it's fun. It's challenging, but it is fun. In fact, I put together 5 tips that might help you if you ever decide this is something you'd be interested in trying. First thing, read good microfiction and bad microfiction. This is important. I want you to read microfiction. It's so good, you're like, there's no way in the world I could ever write something that good. And then read bad microfiction that makes you say, there's no way in the world. No, excuse me. I could definitely write something better than that. In fact, I think a lot of filmmakers have gotten their starts like that. They've gone and seen movies that were so bad, they were like, I could do a better job than that. And a lot of times that's helpful. I'm not even trying to throw anybody under the bus, but I have picked up a lot of collections of microfiction. And in those collections, I've seen really good pieces. And I've seen pieces where I was like, how did this get published? And I think I'm motivated by both of them. I want to write as good as this one, and I want to write better than that one. So read everything that you come across as microfiction, and prose poetry for that matter. And give yourself, this is number 2, give yourself permission to write multiple drafts of the same idea. Don't think of what you write as sacred. I have to tell this to my students because sometimes when they're writing their work, they feel like it's from God to the brain, to the pen, to the page, it's all good. But as Hemingway once said, all first drafts are not quite what they could be, right? So don't think of it as being sacred. You're going to have to edit something. So open yourself up to that. In fact, I have another theory on this one. I call it the Michael Jackson. Yeah, Michael Jackson. We got Michael Jackson on my hat. Another Michael Jackson theory here. You're aware of what Michael Jackson looked like before he got famous. Well, he was a child, you know, the afro and everything. And then how he looked when he passed away, you know. There's a lot of plastic surgery that was done along that line. Think about plastic surgery as editing. And I'm not trying to throw Michael Jackson under the bus on this one, but I will say this. When he got to about 1984, 85, he hit a sweet spot, like, don't do anything else. Everything is perfect. Stop, stop. So I'm always aiming for 84, 85 Michael Jackson when I'm writing. And sometimes I go too far and it turns into 2005 Michael Jackson. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just not what I was hoping for. And then sometimes I don't do enough. And it's like, okay, this is about 1977 Michael Jackson. You know, still cute and everything, but it's not where it could be. So yeah, understand that editing is a part of the process. Give yourself permission to know that upfront so that you don't feel overly stressed to create something that is leaping from the forehead fully formed, okay? Number 3, diversify your reading. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, in terms of the different genres of things you read or styles you read, you should read poetry, you should read fiction, you should read nonfiction, you should read song lyrics, you should read works by people of different backgrounds from yours. In fact, I'm going to be honest with you. A number of the ideas I've actually written about over the past 2 years were stimulated in some way by works that were translated from other languages. There's always something out there to read, something to offer. Like if you're only reading white men, heterosexual, cis, you know, then there's some room there to see other perspectives. And so I try to read as much as I possibly can. And you learn different things from different people, and you take that and you shape it, and it comes out of you in different ways. But I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that reading a lot of different things is going to be essential to your success as a microfictionist. Number 4, don't think about getting published. Just focus on writing the best story that you can. I know that's easier said than done. You know, you've taken a class, you've gotten some positive feedback, you feel like you're going in a certain direction. And the next thing is, where should I submit my work? And I get it. I get it. I get it so much. I could show you my own submission sheet showing all the different things. Times I've been rejected, times I got accepted, times I never heard back from somebody, times I had to withdraw pieces because somebody else was more interested. I get that whole thing. But if we could just take a moment and focus on the story itself, then I think that would be better off in terms of producing our best work. And the 5th thing, you have to do the work. I mean, don't make excuses for why you couldn't get it done. The more times you do something, the better you get at doing that thing. You know, at a certain point, it's all craft. You're doing it over and over, repetition, this, that, and the other. But you do it over and over until that craft starts to transcend into an art. And that only comes from just doing the work. A million things going on in the course of a day. The beautiful thing about microfiction is it doesn't require the same amount of time to write as other writing forms. So those are my thoughts in a nutshell on microfiction, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have regarding anything that I spoke about or anything that you've been thinking about.
We did have a couple questions sent to me in the chat. So we had a student that wasn't able to join us today, but she did have a question ahead of time. She was referring to a work that has a combination of poems and chapters. She wants to know if the poems inspired the chapters or the reverse.
Oh, something that I wrote?
Yes.
Oh, all right. This Daykeeper is the book that I wrote where I had poetry mixed in with with the prose? That's an excellent question. Okay, so originally when I wrote Daykeeper, the plan was to write the entire book as a series of poems, kwansalas. And as I was so far into it, I felt like I was starting to get a little repetitive with what I was saying. There's only so many times you can write a love poem, and everybody has their own vocabulary that they use. And at a certain point, it's just like, okay, this is starting to look the same. So I stepped back and thought about just writing it as a narrative. And then as I did that, I realized that these poems could still work because the poems offer their own power, their own emotion. And in some cases, I found that the poem was so effective that I would use the poem as a chapter itself. So it was a byproduct of just trying to find a way to tell the story the best way I could. And it turned out that the hybrid was what I felt most comfortable with. So, but thank you. That's a great question.
Okay. Next question. What's your biggest struggle with microfiction and how do you overcome it?
It's a very good question, too. All right. So, as I mentioned before, I've written 512 pieces over the last year and some change. There's always a fear I have of running out of ideas. But I don't know if it's possible, but it still feels like it's a real thing, you know? I try not to believe in writer's block, but when you're writing, and I use the word prolific just because when you're writing a lot of stuff, that's just what it is. There's always a fear that that the well's gonna run dry. But another thing though is I've been finding different ways of playing around with the form. So I had an idea for a novel that I thought, oh, I'll just write it as a novella. And then no, I'm just write it as a novelette. No, I just write it as a short story. But then I got an even better idea. Since 100 words, since that's my milieu, that's what I do. I figured why not just tell this novel over the course of 100 word stories, which is what I did. So I'm starting to find new and different ways of playing with singular ideas so that I don't feel like I'm incapable of coming up with new ideas. Just playing around with the form in different ways. It's a struggle though. It's a struggle, but listen to music, just remain open to ideas. I don't know if you guys have ever felt this, but when you're in a serious writing zone, sometimes you become a lot more emotional than you would have been before. Like, say, for example, before you actually decided to write something creative, you might have watched Finding Nemo. It's like, oh, that's nice. Oh, that's nice. But once you've actually started becoming a creative writer and opening yourself to all these different emotions, you're going to watch it differently. It's kind of like being a parent. If you're a parent watching Nemo, it's going to hit you differently than if you're not. And, you find yourself looking at videos on YouTube of people coming home from being deployed and surprising their family members. And it used to be a person just watching it like, oh, that's cool, that's cool. But now you're like, oh man, man. Just open yourself up. And a lot of times ideas come to you when you're a lot more open. So that's what I try to do to stay open. Any other questions?
No other questions in the chat, but if anybody
Okay.
does have a question, I muted all of you, so you just have to raise your hand and I can unmute you.
Well, I have a question for them. How many of you think you might want to try out writing microfiction, a 100-word story or a 50-word story? Cool. I can see Cheryl's hand up. I appreciate that. Um, it's fun. It's a lot of fun. In fact, I can recommend some places to go to read more things if you're interested in it. Um, there is a literary journal called 100 Word Story. And then there's also an online journal called 50 Word Stories. And there are literally hundreds of stories there. And once you read a lot of different stories, you start to understand what people can do with the form. Like you think that you have it on lock with what you're doing, and then you see someone else using a receipt to tell a story. And you're like, a receipt? Oh, I've seen letters where, and I know Lydia Davis has done this before, where you're writing a letter to somebody and explaining something, and the whole world comes alive within the letter. I had a story that I'd written about. It's just the thought came from every house on a street has a particular value, and I'm not trying to, get too deep here, but when you're buying a house, you have to ask yourself, do you want to be the person who owns the most valuable house on the street? Because that means the neighbor next door who doesn't have a house with the same value can do things that could potentially affect the value of your house. And I thought about like this whole idea of being the person with the least valuable house on a street that has other valuable houses, and how that would make a person feel if the neighbors treated them like they had the least valuable house on the street. In fact, I don't have that in front of me. I actually wrote a story recently about that, and it was tinged in humor. But there was a neighbor who had the largest house who would walk his dog and let his dog defecate on the lawn of the guy with the house that was the least valuable in the neighborhood. And the guy with the least valuable house was writing a letter to his neighbor about this incident. And, again, something you can play around with in a very short form. And you learn all the dynamics of class and all of this all through the 100 words at the end. So, yeah, it's fun to see what people can do with that. So, I do encourage you, check out those journals. There are a variety of other ones. There's one called The Sense of Fictionist. And just great places to go to see stories and just read until you feel like you're ready to jump in. Like it's like double dutch. When you're ready, then you get in there. And you might trip on the ropes. It's okay because everybody who's learning double dutch has to go through that. But eventually you'll be able to do kicks and jump around and dance and everything while they're throwing the ropes. So it's all good. Any other questions?
Yeah, I did have a question. So I'm obviously important as a writer to read a lot of works, but I'm wondering how you feel about listening to things like songs, for instance, or audiobooks. Yeah.
Okay, so that's an excellent question, Shayna. I would encourage you to take in the stories the way you feel most comfortable. But I will say this, like, I have a friend of mine, he's also a novelist, and he does almost all of his books as audiobooks. And I love audiobooks, especially when you're driving. It allows you to have the story going while you're doing something else. But there is something that comes with actually reading the story that you're not going to get from the audio. And this is the one thing you have to be aware of. How does it look on the page? Like, is this a paragraph here? How is the author using the white of the page here? So that's something you don't always get a chance. You can imagine what it looks like. Let me give you an example. So it works like two levels. Like say that you're getting the idea strictly from having seen it, like Harry Potter, first movie. You watch the movie, you're like, oh wow, this is really cool if you've never read the book before. And you're like, what does this look like on the page? I mean, how do they tell the story on the page? And then you read and you see how J.K. Rowling does it on the page, and you're like, oh, this is pretty cool. If you listen to it audio, you would have an idea, but you wouldn't know exactly what the paragraph breaks are, how she's manipulating the page. Because really, the thing that keeps people reading is, and I'm going to be honest with you here, most people are going to read if there's a comfortable amount of white space on the page. Mm. If you're going to give me one of those Philip Roth paragraphs that goes on for 4 pages, like he did in Human Stain, it's like, okay, at what point can I stick my bookmark in here just in the event that I'm not completely committed to completing this particular paragraph? And there is no place that you can really stick it there. So I always think about, where can a person pause? and how can I effectively use the page so that I encourage them to read further. But if they aren't interested or they want to stop for any reason, they have a breaking spot. So that's the only thing, Shannon. Everything else, you're getting the story as it was intended. I think it's always good to experience the stories in different ways. But if you have a chance to look at it on the page and just see what it looks like, that would be really helpful to you when you write your own stories.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I kind of assumed that the answer would be such. I was curious as to what you would say. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I have a question.
Okay.
Which piece of microfiction would you say you're most proud of?
That's a good question. Right now? You know what's funny? The pieces that I like are not the pieces everybody else likes. Like I've had about 20 pieces published with 50-word stories. And the story that did the best, it was a nominee for like the story of the year, was a story about a kid who learned to hunt the monsters under the bed. And it was just the idea of it. But I'm like, it's this throwaway idea as far as I was concerned. But it meant so much to so many people. People started writing their own versions of the story. And I was like, oh, wow. I don't really know if I have one. I mean, a 100-word story magazine was the first one magazine ever just devote itself entirely to 100-word stories. And it was a dream of mine to get a piece published there. And I did get a piece published there, but I don't feel like that was my best story. So I have a collection coming out in May called Keep It 100. And okay, I have an answer for you. Remember I said the 100-word stories forming a complete arc of a novel? I have a story or not novella called A Burst of Gray. And while it's not one single story, it's the arc of those 100 stories. I think that's the best thing I've written to date. And it's the thing I'm actually planning on submitting to a publisher later on this afternoon. So fingers crossed that somebody else thinks it's a good story too.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Faith.
I have a question.
Okay.
So when you like advise going after like something that's written badly, in your like report of reading through bad written stuff, let's say, or poorly written rather, what are some key components you notice that are considered like poorly written material?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay, so with me, when it comes to poorly written material, if I see where there's a cap on the imagination, I think one of the biggest things we have to worry about as writers in general, and especially when you're dealing in a form that's so close to poetry, is you want to avoid cliches.
Okay.
And so I'm a big fan of horror. I mean, I love horror stories. Something just, I need to feel uncomfortable. And I'll read a lot of 100-word stories that are horror stories. And it's just cliche. Yeah, they squeeze into 100 words, but it's still a cliche. Let me give you an example, Brighton, if you don't mind. Like, this is a story that was not designed to be a horror story. My daughter, she's 7 years old, and she loves to give me ideas for stories. So she's like, what about, like with dolls, you sew the eyes on the dolls, and there's a box of eyes to sew on the dolls. And I'm just like, Now she meant it to be something fun and light. But in my twisted mind, I created a story called Eyes. When she finished each doll, she reached into the box of eyes, carefully selecting the perfect pair before sewing them on. A nice finishing touch. She had never bought eyes before. In fact, she didn't know where they came from. But every time she opened the old box she had purchased at the antique shop, the eyes appeared. So she continued to make the dolls, not because she needed somewhere to put the eyes. So that to me is a little unsettling. And I guess for some people, it's like the only thing that scares them are demons or ghosts or people with chainsaws. But for me, it's like, I just like to feel uncomfortable. Just, you know. And when you see a lot of the stories, it's like the lowest hanging fruit possible. You know, the fruit is so low, it's like lying on the ground bruised, and they pick it up and make a story out of it. So avoid cliches. You know, you're working in such a short space. Ask yourself, do you really need to use onomatopoeia? I mean, do you really need to have bam, zag, something like that? And it's like there are places that would work. But in 100 words, you want to give one of your 100 words to that particular sound. Can't you just show me in another way so that I don't feel like I'm kind of, I don't know. I have a lot of, I guess, pet peeves about things. But yeah, you see stories where it's just like even the turn's not interesting. It's just, but you know, everybody has to start somewhere.
Right.
And
right.
I'll leave it at that. Was that helpful at all, Brighton?
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
is your name Britton or Brighton?
Britain, yeah.
Britton. My apologies, Britton.
Oh no, it's all good. No big deal. I was I actually had another question in light of all that.
Okay.
Kind of in reference to the whole horror motif is what exactly, as far as you're concerned, if you abstract out the uncomfortability factor within a story that you're reading, what is that usually, or how does that look like as far as abstraction is concerned?
I don't know if I could really divorce, you know, my reaction from the story itself and
Okay.
still be able to define the story as a particular genre. I think the point of a horror story is to scare or to make a person feel unsettled.
Right. Okay.
And if the intention is to do that, a lot of times people use cliches. They're like, okay, if there's a werewolf here, and I've written a werewolf story before, but my werewolf story, I'm like, how can I make this thing different? Because everyone has a werewolf story, right? You've seen vampires that glisten in the sun and fall in love, and you've seen vampires who are like tearing through people. They don't even look like they're human beings. Um, Trying to find the unique take on it. I don't know if you've ever heard of a writer by the name of Octavia Butler, but she wrote a book called Fledgling. And that to me is one of the most original takes on the vampire idea. So I'm always looking for something that's original that I haven't seen. But here's the thing too. How do you know if something is cliche? Going back to the idea of reading, if you read a lot in an area, you'll know what's being done over and over again. You can spot the things that might be cliche and the things that are not. But that comes from your commitment to learning as much as you can about that particular area. But if you feel like something that the intention of what you're writing is horror, then I would just follow that. And then just, you know, talk with your writing group, get feedback and see if it's being perceived that way and what might be altered to help you to achieve the goal that you're setting for yourself with that effect.
Right on. Okay. Awesome. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you for your question.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Cheryl, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yes, I do. When you're beginning to write, how beneficial is it to join a writer's group, or should you wait till you're farther down the path of being a writer? Like sending something for publication and it's rejected, or what's the proper timing, or is there a proper timing for joining a group?
I don't think that there is a proper time, just when you're ready. You know, I've lived in Hampton, Virginia since 2008, and I just joined a writing group in 2020.
Oh.
So yeah, I went 12 years without even belonging to a writer's group. One of the difficulties I had, I think because I also teach at a university here, is that I found myself in writing groups, not actually I was in one writing group. A colleague created one, and I went to a couple of events and then kind of ducked out. But I found that when I was going to these places, that I wound up doing my job for free,
Mm.
because there weren't a lot of people who were like my peers. There were people who were looking for feedback and instruction, and I do that all day long. And then to come to a writing group and be looked at to provide the same thing, to me, it just wasn't a quid pro quo situation. But honestly, you have to be careful about the people that you choose for your writing group. Are they genuinely trying to be good writers and help to make their fellow writers better? Because there's always somebody whose motive is to tear people down so that they feel better about their own work. So you have to sift through and kind of find a group that you feel comfortable with.
So the first one that you join is not right for you. You can just, it's like finding a good doctor. You just keep going down the
Exactly.
list.
Yep. Until you find one you feel comfortable with, and you're like, okay, this is where I feel comfortable. And the group I belong to now is called the James River Writers, and they're based out of Richmond, which is about 75 miles from where I am. And if the pandemic weren't going on, I wouldn't even be able to be in the group. But there's so many talented writers, and they're different levels. There are people who are trying to get their first pieces published, and then there are people who have not only had several books published, but have won national awards. And then you have people who are coming to the group from other areas like screenwriting and different things like that. So it's just an eclectic group of people. And I don't feel like there's any person who's trying to use that as a place to get glory on themselves, or to do any of the other stuff that's negative and doesn't really help anybody out. Just a positive group of people. And
Thanks.
yeah, that's what I would recommend to you.
Thank you.
Hey, Rand, if I could just jump in here, because you gave me a segue to something that I wanted to announce anyway. I just got an email from the woman who's handles membership for the James River Writers Association. It is, you have to pay to belong, and they have like subgroups that deal with like writers groups, and they have an annual conference. It's a good organization, but it is down in Richmond, and Zoom makes it easier right now. Having said that, they are running a special discount for student rates. And so I'd have to dig that out, but I will announce that special rate and that process to my class. But if you are not in my class, please send an email to Kay Lewis and I'll give you the link to that information. So thanks for letting me interrupt you, Rand.
No, that's fine. I was actually recently invited to be on the board for the organization. So I love working with them. They're a great bunch of people. And if you're looking to belong to an organization and you don't mind, belonging to an organization that's based out of Richmond, I would definitely vouch for the fact that they're a wonderful group to belong to. A lot of activities. They just have writer meetups sometimes where people just get a chance to just talk, and they break you into breakout sessions, and just hearing what other people are working on and what they're going through right now. Because it's not easy writing during a pandemic, and to see how people are finding ways to uplift each other and their art form, it's just amazing. So
I have another question, if I may.
okay.
When you're writing something and you feel really good about it, and I'll be honest, this is a reaction I had in one of my classes with Professor Lewis. The story that we listened to, it was very, very good. And I've always felt like my writing is good, but I really felt like I didn't know what the heck I was doing, because this story was so much above what I have ever written. Have you ever had to deal with that, and how do you work through it?
Okay, I have a great story for you on that one. Okay, so back in 2006, I'd stopped practicing law, and I was just kind of out there in the wind trying to hustle and make money while I figured out the next step. I got accepted to a program called the Hurston Wright Foundation Writers Week. And I was one of about 8 people in the class. And I, went there. I'm like, oh, I got to accept it. I must be about it. I have my stories and everything. And there was one guy who was in class. He's a truck driver. He never spoke. Just this very thin guy that had a weed symbol on the hat, and he just never spoke. He just sat there in the class. Half the time, he wasn't even completely on the ground with us, but he would never speak. And finally, one day after we've been going around sharing our pieces, the instructor was like, "Would you like to share a piece?" He's like, "Can I read it for you?" He's like, "Sure, if you want." And the professor starts to read the piece, and it is the most amazing thing that I'd ever heard up to that point in my life. And I was like, "Oh my God, you're a genius!" He opened up a little bit after that, like he would smile more and kind of, but he was the one that messed my mind up. So if you're talking about a situation where you're in a class and you experience somebody, there's always a person who's going to make you feel that way.
Yes.
This is what I have to say to you about that. The grass always looks greener. We always want what somebody else has. Like, oh, I want more like this. I have my computer on top of a wooden desk right now. I know what this is made out of. I put this together. I know what it's made of. What looks like a mahogany desk over there might be particle board thrown together. You don't know what that whole situation is. Oftentimes it's best, almost like a racehorse. Just put the blinders on, run your race, do your thing. Focus on being the best writer you can be. Don't look, it's tempting to look over there because you hear the horse galloping in the next lane. Just, hey, this is me. This is what I'm doing. My race looks different. If I look over at their race, I might confuse myself and try to go over to their lane, and I'm never going to be able to run their race. Don't try to mimic them. Just figure out who you are and tell your story. As much as we might say like, oh, I'm a big fan of Alice Munro, or I'm a big fan of Toni Morrison or somebody like that, we're never going to write like that, like those people, because they wrote like themselves. And if we imitate the people that we like, we sometimes produce work that's like one level beneath what they did. So let me ask you to consider something else. Rather than trying to think about other people and how well they write, think about 3 or 4 writers that you love for whatever reason. If the 3 or 4 of those authors got together and had a literary baby, could you write something that looks like their literary baby? Because you know what it is that you like of what they do. You develop your style by combining things you like from other people. And that's a different way of thinking about art altogether. Rather than think about how much you hate something, look at it and say, is there one thing out of this that I could put in my own toolbox? Rather than throwing out the baby with the bathwater, how about we eat the fish and spit out the bones?
Okay.
If you put together the things that you like, you're going to cobble together your own particular style. And someone else is going to look at you and say, oh, I'd be good to go. It's all relative. Just focus on running your race.
Thank you.
No problem. Was that helpful at all, Cheryl?
Extremely.
Okay.
It's kind of got my thinking going in a better direction instead of going on, forget this. It's kind of giving me a little bit of motivation to jump back in the mess and get it done.
But keep in mind what I said about Alice Munro and Toni Morrison. Neither one of them really had time to write. They wrote what they could write with what they had. It just turned out that they wrote what was in them to write, and we responded the way we responded to it. I think Alice Munro wanted to write a novel, but there are kids, this, that, and the other. You write what you can write. And just find your voice, do your thing, and you'll be fine.
When you first submitted work to a publisher, it doesn't all a little bit of words. Is it standard practice to submit a novel or a novella or just whatever, short story or microfiction? There's not a certain pattern. You talk about patterns in writing. There's not a certain formula or pattern that you follow if you want to get yourself published. I like to write essays,
Okay.
for very, not microfiction, but 3 or 4 page stories. Is there, I don't guess there's a particular flow of submissions you should send in. It's just whatever you're best at.
Yeah, well, what I would do if I was going to submit to a particular periodical, though, is to read the type of stuff that they typically publish.
Okay.
So you'll know what their taste is.
Okay.
I have a piece that's coming out in a periodical at the end of the year. And they actually advised me up front, like, take a look at some of the pieces we've written. These are the type of stories we do. And, you know, see if you can work within these, you know, with these parameters. So it just depends. But there are places that, of course, will take your work without any of those considerations. But it's always helpful to read a couple of issues just to see what the editorial taste is and see if that's actually worth, you know, investing your effort into sending your piece that place.
Okay. Thanks.
No problem.
Well, I want to thank Cheryl for that question, and also for the rest of the people in my class. Toward the end of the semester, excuse me, about the time that we're working on Rand, for your information, the college puts out a literary journal that is called Growl, and the class uses that literary journal to kind of get into a little bit about the business of writing, which is just such a quagmire. And then also, you know, like the process of editing and what individual tastes, how those tastes influence who's making decisions. And so we'll be going into that in more detail, Cheryl. That's a great question, and probably could be a class unto itself, and probably something that Rand could stand and talk about for the next 6 hours if we had that time. And speaking of which, I want to thank all of you for coming to Mr. Walker's presentation. I was so happy that he was, as I said, willing to talk to us. And I think he brings such a common sense, kind way of talking to this class and to the other people from Lord Fairfax, that I don't regret in any way the recommendation that he come talk to us.
Thank you.
Having said that, in addition, please, while I have all of you, don't forget, we need submissions for Growl. It's during the pandemic, so we don't have as many submissions as we normally do. I'm going to come to each of your houses and bang on your heads if you don't send something in. So having said that, thank you so much, so very much, Rand, for being with us today. We really appreciated it, and I wish you so much luck with your microfiction.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad to be here with you.
It was great. Thank you.